Hello, everyone, and welcome to the recently announced SMPS DEI Town Hall on Inclusive Leadership. We appreciate your continued attendance at these programs that we've been offering over the past several months. My name is Asheya Warren with Praxis Strategic Consulting. I am the chair of the SMPS DEI committee. We have now been upgraded to a full-fledged continuing committee as opposed to a task force. So that is because SMPS is so committed to this work that we are doing and continuing to make sure that DEI, inclusion, diversity is always top of mind through our programming. Today, we have a robust conversation and workshop planned for you. One of the things that I would like to kick off in our conversation before we begin our program is acknowledging that May is Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And we just want to pay tribute to the generations of Asian and Pacific Islanders who have enriched America's history and are so instrumental to our continued success as a nation. From the lens of the AEC industries, we recognize the significant contributions made by the AAPI community to the built environment and want to continue to encourage you all to explore cultural competencies by discovering contributions from everyone that makes America great and contributes to the tapestry of this country. So with that, I would like to introduce our workshop today. We're going to be having a deep dive into inclusive leadership. At first, we'll be having a training workshop presented by a good friend of mine, Toni Lowe. She is a global diversity and inclusion and human resource practitioner with over 18 years of innovative, transformative leadership experience supporting Fortune 100 companies. She's going to give us a very thorough deep dive into inclusive leadership, and at the end of that program, we'll open it up for Q&A as a bridge, and then we'll have a couple of poll questions, and then we'll transition into our panel conversation. Once we transition into the panel conversation, I will introduce our co-panelists, and that will conclude our day. So I'm going to turn it over to Toni. Toni?
Thank you so much for having me today, Asheya. I'm so excited to be speaking to everyone today. We're going to be talking a little bit about inclusive leadership. And I want to make sure everyone can hear me. Can you guys hear me well? Just drop a little thumbs up in the chat. Yes, great. Awesome. So I'm going to jump right in and share my screen. All right, so we're going to be talking today about building an inclusive workplace and exploring the pillars of DEI+A, which stands for, as many of you know, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and the role of inclusion and belonging. But before we do that, let me give you an overview of some of the things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about defining diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and what that means, particularly in the workplace at a base level. We're going to talk about the 4 pillars of resilient, inclusive teams, what I believe are the 5 barriers to belonging in the workplace, creating psychological safety, and some actions that everyone can take from here as an action forward on how to improve your workplace and create inclusive teams. But as we get started, I always love, because although my bio gets read, people Google me, they look me up. I think it's important to know that at a baseline, when we start to have conversations about belonging and inclusion, it's about an understanding of who you are and how you show up in the workplace. So as a first exercise, what I'd love for each of you to do is think about 1 to 2 words that describe you in the workplace. How do you show up in the workplace, and how do you best belong? And as I'm doing that, I'll talk to you a little bit about myself. So what I've discovered over a 20-year career there are 5 ways that I've learned not only to show up, but are my most authentic self and how I belong and contribute to teams. First, I am equity obsessed. I've been equity obsessed since I was like a 6-year-old advocating for myself on a school bus, right? First incident of being othered was on a school bus, and I was 6 years old. And ever since then, I've been equity obsessed. So there's no surprise to my parents that I've ended up in the line of work that I've been in. Secondly, I've always been a professional bias disruptor. I think earlier in my career, my natural curiosity to challenge bias, to challenge the status quo, to raise my hand and ask, why are we doing it in this way? Or to challenge the impacts to groups that might be marginalized. I didn't really necessarily have the framework or the words for that. But I've come to know that I'm a professional bias disruptor. The third thing is a teller of truth. I've always been, both in personal and professional relationships, a truth teller. To be honest and to be authentic, I think is the only way to show up. And then lastly is radically free. What does that mean? It means in the workplace that what I've come to know about myself is that I need unfettered autonomy in order to be my best self. So I don't do well in environments where I am micromanaged or hovered over, or not there. I'm not empowered to be the smart person they've hired me to be and an expert in the field that I've been in. I start with that as you guys start to understand who you are in the workplace, and you start to think about the teams that you manage and the people that you oversee within organizations that you're a part of, is to think about who you are in the workplace, how you show up and how you best belong. And in centering that, I think it helps you also identify ways that other people show up around you in your team. So wanted to start with that. So first and foremost, let's talk a little bit about diversity, equity, inclusion being defined. First and foremost, diversity, as we know, is really representation. It's the visible and invisible ways that qualify us in the workplace based on our differences: gender, sexual orientation, age, religion, marital status, all those things. We know that representation is important, but that is the D in the DEI+A. Equity is the process, right? Equity is the fairness in the process of decision-making, and it enables transparency and bias mitigation if done correctly. So who is affected by the processes that we put in place, and is it equitable in how we hire, promote, fire even, right? The experiences of how we even offboard people. Inclusion is the behavior, right? Inclusion is a range of actions that individuals in the organization, how they behave in terms of building the value system. I always say that behavior or a code of conduct is not codified by what you've written in your handbook, but more about the culmination of the behaviors of your leaders and your employees that make up what your true culture is, right? So behavior is super important. And then lastly is belonging, right? Belonging is about connection. It is about, it's resulting in the emotion of how someone feels and how they reflect the degrees for which they are connected to the company, their role, their job, and how they're empowered to do their role. So again, representation, process, behavior, and connection. Important for you to understand that as a baseline as we talk about the importance, more importantly, the importance of inclusion and belonging. So when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I always say that belonging is a subset of inclusion. You don't really get belonging without getting right, in my opinion, DE&I. But the 4 pillars to building inclusive teams, my opinion, is belonging, psychological safety, wellness, and mental health. These things combined being, aligned to or being mission critical priorities for your DE&I strategy really help to propel a culture and an environment where everyone feels whole and feels connected. So if that is the case, where are we today in terms of companies? I thought there was an interesting thing to share that came from Gallup around the readiness gap. So 79% of organizations say fostering a sense of belonging in the workplace is important to their success over the next 12 or 18 months. And as you all have seen, post 2020, we've gone through amazing evolution in the workplace, in part due to societal changes and effects. And what we know is that many people came and stood in solidarity and said, we know that fostering a sense of belonging in our workplace is important. But many of those, that 79% say they are not very ready to address the trend. The interesting part to that is that 55%, even though they know, 79% know that that's important over the next 12 to 18 months, 55% of employees agree that their organization have policies that promote diversity and inclusion, but don't see or feel it in their everyday workplace, according to Gallup. So what that means is that there is a readiness gap around what does it mean to do DE&I? What are the barriers to that being successful? And then how do people see themselves inside your teams, your organizations, in terms of belonging and inclusion? So for me, I feel like the 5 most common barriers to DE&I, having done this work, I've been an HR practitioner for 20 years, probably the last 9 years, specifically focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion work, worked for very large companies, consulted for many years as well alongside that work. And what I often find as a trend are these 5 areas. First is performative DEI programming, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Microaggressions, as many of you know, I have done many talks on microaggressions. And then deprioritizing wellness, how we look at wellness in the workplace and the expectations of mental health and wellness in the workplace, exclusionary behavior, and then psychological safety, creating psychological safety. These are the 5 most common barriers, I believe, to DE&I. So let's jump into that. So first and foremost, performative DE&I. It is really being concerned with the show of DE&I to convey support or solidarity externally, but internally you're neglecting the things that matter, the policy, action, or really designing a system that is reflective of your DE&I outward position, right? So the outcomes of that is that it feels very insincere in nature to promote your organizational brand in this way, but internally, there's a disconnect for the employees, particularly those that are from marginalized communities, in terms of how they feel inside your organization. So this level of performative DE&I that is kind of false allyship in a way, because it doesn't reflect what is happening internally, right? So that is one of the top barriers, and we see that often. Second to that is microaggressions, right? So microaggressions are subtle behaviors. We call them death by 1,000 cuts because they are verbal and nonverbal, everyday slights, right? That send denigrating messages, typically to marginalized groups that are perhaps derogatory or harmful in nature. And we'll talk a little bit about how that shows up. So 3 common ways, there are many. Microaggressions was coined by Dr. Chester M. Pierce, but kind of revitalized over the last decade by Daryl Wing Su. And it has become its own thing, and there are many ways to talk about microaggressions. But 3 common ones you see in the workplace is a foreign in one's own land, meaning people will other you and saying, oh, because you look away or you sound away, where are you from? And you're like, I'm from San Diego. So, and people are like, but where are you from, right? So this idea that you're foreign, despite the fact that you might be native to the country that you're currently residing in. The myth of meritocracy, right? This idea that you could not have made it to the position you're in based on your own merit and skill, but in some way you're a quota, or you only were hired because you were this, that, or the other, or we needed diversity numbers, right? So this idea, the myth of meritocracy, and then refusing, as simple to acknowledge pronouns, right? How people prefer to show up in the workplace or how they see themselves, and not being willing to acknowledge that. So these are 3 ways that microaggressions show up that affect inclusive workplaces. And so when you think about that, confronting microaggressions, the challenge really is the complexity based on one's personal point of view. if I have a point of view, I think that the challenge with microaggressions is often they're subjective and they require that other people see them as well in some ways. The fear of being dismissed, right, is a great fear for those that feel like they've been confronted with a microaggression. And then the overwhelming emotional burden of proof in the moment to prove that the thing that happened to me or the thing that you said affected me, you know, and it is very much, you know, an impact versus intent situation. So just because your intention is not to offend or to be not inclusive doesn't mean that there wasn't an impact there, right? So the self-awareness that it requires for both leaders and peers is high. It's a high level of self-awareness. The next is the changing landscape of wellness and mental health. And I thought that this was an interesting thing to share. The Mindshare Partner Report talks about what is happening in the landscape change of employees, right? So first they said that millennials are 3.5 times more likely than boomers were to say that their work environment contributed to their mental health symptoms. 80% of transgender employees believe the same compared to 37% overall of the average. What's more, 50% of millennials, 75% of Gen Zs, 47% of both Latinx and Black employees, and 90% of transgender employees have left a previous role, at least in part to mental health reasons, compared to 34% of all respondents overall, the average. So what it says is that our environments in terms of wellness and mental health are affecting our employees' ability, whether you're in a work environment or within an organization, people to belong in those spaces. I think one of the things that's important, and we saw this coming out of COVID, is that what it really resonated was the rise in mental health challenges for everyone. And I think one of the really focusing on one of the priorities of like what is a barrier is deprioritizing wellness. Companies who deprioritize wellness basically do the following: provide no wellness options as a part of their culture, ignore the data. I'm big on like data-driven responses, right? What is the data telling us about our work environment? So things like EMPS or Gallup surveys or Culture and AMP or whatever you do internally as an organization or as a company, don't ignore the data, exit data. Companies that don't celebrate difference or external factors that motivate or demotivate, right? If something is happening in the external market, as we know today, we've kind of gotten a glimpse of the leak for the Supreme Court. And depending on how you feel about that, that stressor could add stress to certain demographics, right? In terms of the changes that might occur if that is overturned. And so we have to pay attention to what is happening and acknowledge those things. So imagine getting on a Zoom call, you know, post a major event, and someone saying, "How was your weekend?" and everyone's saying, "Oh, it was great. We went to, you know, this happened, and you come from, you know, a marginalized group where there's like a rise in, you know, Asian hate, and you've experienced something that was very traumatic, like, you know, we didn't leave our house this weekend because of this." So the idea of acknowledging is important in order to support wellness. Avoiding new ways of working, you know, companies that have been resistant to hybrid remote work, and then having no strategy for increased workload and not being adaptable to change that affect employees, right? How do we address the change that is happening both in the external market and internally for employees, and also within our organizations, our civic organizations as well? I thought what was interesting is that WorkHuman did some research on the impact of the pandemic and found that workers overall were feeling 37% more anxious, 31% more isolated, 28% more overwhelmed, and 24% less motivated since the start of the pandemic. And what's interesting to that is that the pandemic actually has increased revenue, right? So people are overworking, they're working actually harder, than what they were working when they were in office, but are feeling incredibly less motivated. And that is a sign of making sure, or that is a sign of that, your company, if you're seeing that in your results, is deprioritizing wellness. Exclusionary behavior is one of the most important pieces of this, right? A Better Up study found that a single incidence of micro-exclusion can lead to an immediate 25% decline in an individual's performance on a team project, right? So think about the success of an organization and think about oftentimes how we devalue people who we feel their work product is not great and how quickly they're dismissed in the workplace. But could it be that the culture of inclusion and belonging that exists within our organization is a reflection of that, right? So this idea that there's a 25% decline in an individual's performance. One of the things that I often talk about is that we've evolved on our public attitudes towards race and gender and varying intersections, right, over the decades. There's tons of research to say we've evolved. But I think the term modern discrimination is probably a new way in which discrimination is showing up in the workplace, right? So less and less it's about a inflicted, harm that is overt in the workplace, and more and more it's becoming these big or small actions of helping or advantaging those who are more like yourself. So discrimination really has a new face. It doesn't look like it looked in the 60s. It doesn't look like it looked in the 70s or the 80s. It now is friendly. We call it, nice racism. It is oftentimes not even so much about exclusionary behavior in the way that it showed up 40 years ago, but more about excluding in the way of advantaging people that are more like yourself, right? So as we think about our teams and we think about who we're hiring, who we prefer in the workplace, who are our confidants in the workplace, let's think about how much they are like us and how, based on that, we're excluding people. Oftentimes I hear things like, well, I didn't invite her to golf because, not because I don't like her, just because that's not who I don't want to golf with. And I don't see that as exclusionary. But if what is happening during that time is an advantage of knowing what's going on with the business, an advantage of rapport, it can be a new form of modern discrimination. So how does that make people feel? Overwhelmingly, what the stats say, whether you're looking at Pew Research or McKinsey or Coquel, you'll see that overwhelmingly our employees are feeling uncomfortable, weak, powerless, othered, invalidated. And that's the same as it relates to, organizations. Overall, how employees are feeling based on the lack of belonging or inclusion. So what does that mean? Belonging drivers. In 2019, Better Up did a study around belonging, and they said belonging can lead to an estimated 56% increase in job performance. So the opposite of exclusion, micro-exclusion, it can lead to an increase in job performance, a 50% reduction in turnover, and 75% decrease in sick days, 75%. Decrease in sick days. This is what we know about belonging. So you would think if we have this research that has been studied, that people would, in organization and leaders within organizations would be more focused on belonging, but not quite there yet. The 7 belonging drivers, which I think is always an interesting conversation to have, is organizational culture, leadership behaviors, personal relationships, organizational purpose, opportunity, and growth, the nature of the work, and fairness. When I was researching this particular topic and I came upon this study, if someone had asked me, if they had given me a quiz and they said, prioritize these in order, I would have thought for sure, going back to someone who's equity obsessed, that fairness would have been number 1. I would have thought that most people, in terms of their belonging drivers, want to be treated fairly first. What we've come to find is that as we think about the pillars of inclusive teams, what employees are really telling us is that organizational culture, leadership behavior, and personal relationships are the top 3 priorities to belonging. And as a byproduct of that, fairness comes out of that, right? And so an organizational purpose, an opportunity to grow, and the nature of the work, right? But if you actually look at the sequence of how this is set up in terms of the top 7 belonging drivers, the byproduct of each of these is the next thing, right? And so it makes a lot of sense. But if I had been asked what I thought was going to be the first belonging drivers, I certainly would have said it would have been fairness. So these are the top 7. And lastly, the barriers, psychological safety. Psychological safety was coined by Dr. Amy Edmondson. And it's the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. I often say when I'm managing teams and dealing with teams is the ability to fail forward. How resilient are you with failure? How resilient are you with feedback? Feedback is, as we know, a gift. And the ability to be able to speak up and say how you feel or to disagree. Creating psychological teams, the predictive index outlines signs of low psychological safety on teams. So if you're thinking about your team today and you're wanting to know, would I consider myself to be a leader who leads a team that is psychologically safe? Here are some things to think about. Teams that avoid difficult conversations are hot button topics. Colleagues that don't ask many questions during meetings tend to never really ask questions. Employees that don't feel comfortable owning up to mistakes or place blames on each other. So sort of this pointing the finger behavior because mistakes are not welcome. Meetings or discussions that are dominated by leadership. Feedback that is infrequent. So if you're sending out feedback surveys and there's not a lot of there's low engagement, people don't feel psychologically safe to share that feedback. And employees who do not ask one another for help. So there's like this protection of knowledge being close to the chest, right? That is all these things are signs that your teams are not feeling psychologically safe as the final sort of barrier. So what can each of you do? As individuals, some of the things that I think are important to remember is to not be a passive bystander. When you see an opportunity for improvement within your team, don't be a passive bystander. Raise your hand and say, it might be better if we did it this way. Are we considering parents, or are we considering those that might be single? Making sure that the meeting time or how we, just different things. I remember someone years ago in the workplace pointing out that we actually had one of our leaders walk in the shoes of someone that was, abled, and basically we ended up changing all the meeting rooms to have a Braille code for the meeting room because, just simple things, or turning off the elevators made it silent. So, he didn't know where he was when we would just like randomly want to conserve energy and turn off the escalator. So just simple feedback like that, and someone mentioning it and someone raising that concern changed it all. So that's a small example. Don't normalize bias. I think that there's a propensity in teams to hear a thing, to know that it might be offensive, it might be a microaggression, might just be uncomfortable for everyone, but to normalize it with like an awkward laugh or to dismiss it as this is just how Toni is, and to not address it. So we want to make sure that we do not normalize bias. And then the third thing is individually get familiar with belonging drivers. Measure yourself, your team, your organization against those belonging drivers. Lastly, what can we do in actions teams can take for what I believe is the foundational for success in inclusion and belonging, and how we can work together better is to, again, get familiar with the belonging drivers as a team, uncover who is othered on your team and make space, establish expectations of inclusive behavior, upskill on cultural competency, and alleviate the burden of education to marginalized groups. Oftentimes you'll see that we want marginalized communities to actually do all the educating, which is a very unfair burden. and then challenge and disrupt bias and build trust, right? We know in the end that trust is, I call it the hidden gem to DEIB. It is the one thing that we don't talk about that is tucked in the crevices of all of those pillars, is that without trust, we have nothing. And so these are the actions teams can take moving forward. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you guys for listening. Any questions in the chat I need to address?
Toni, yes, we do have a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
One of them is, and I think you may have covered this, but I think a better illustrative example might be helpful for our audience, or maybe a couple of them, is real life examples of microaggressions that people may encounter in the workplace.
Yeah, I can probably, I mean, there's so many. And actually there's a list that was curated by Dr. Daryl Wing-Sue. I'll send that over to Asheya to send out. But there are so many. I gave 3 in the presentation. I think the resulting factor, and also humble plug, I have a whole LinkedIn course on dealing with microaggressions in the workplace. So you can click that from my LinkedIn page as well. But there are a ton of resources around microaggressions, and I think I gave 3, so that should answer the question.
Thank you. Yes, and I do believe that we have or will have your LinkedIn microaggressions course on the SMPS DEI webpage as a link. So certainly we invite all of the attendees to explore that. It's a really, really great workshop. And I'm just gonna plug her humble plug and say you need to watch that course. One other question is, any suggestions on how to encourage staff to let go of the fear of making mistakes? And we've talked about this in previous panels, and you know, there's a heightened sense of fear, particularly in our industry, of people doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing. And I always say that there is a personal amount of work that needs to be done, right? And so what are your thoughts on how to encourage staff to let go of their fear of making mistakes?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, like, this goes back to psychological safety, right? And also, like I said, failing forward. I mentioned that word. It's a word that I use on teams often, right? Failing forward is, how do we raise up failure as an opportunity for everyone to learn, right? In the medical industry, sometimes you'll see, like, if a doctor makes a mistake or something goes wrong with a patient, they'll have debriefs and they'll talk about what happened every step of the way and what could have been done differently. Were there other options, right? There's like sort of a process for that. I think in the workplace, we need to practice a certain level of hygiene around failure, right? Because when people fail, if we fail with a client, if we fail, we need to really have a conversation about it, right? And I think you have to be comfortable with the person who made a failure. How can we talk about it, you know, get to a good place? But I think part of this is that people, if people are not comfortable sharing that they failed, or you feel a resistance to that, it's normally because of the behaviors that you've not codified by your handbook, but by how leaders behave when people fail, right? If people are let go, if people are sort of like, you know, excluded out of conversations now, taken off of the important clients because they've failed, that's sort of an indication that you are not feeling forward. So that would be my advice.
I think that's also really interesting, because different people have different opportunities to fail forward, right?
Yes.
Everyone does not always have the same amount of grace to even fail forward, right? And so I think as we're considering what that looks like and who does have that runway and who does not have that runway, like as you're doing your personnel exit interviews or even performance reviews, how are you measuring that, right? And who has a failure that's looked at as a learning opportunity versus who has a failure that's a fireable offense, right? And looking at the human side of what that looks like.
And one thing too, to add to that, Asheya, is that one of the things I've recommended often is when you're going through whether it's 9 grids on, how people are doing or promoting, or whether it is performance season, is having a bias disruption accountability partner where the sole job of that person to do is to sit in the room and listen how you are evaluating talent, and to call things out. Well, we described this person with this adjective and it wasn't in a negative way, but in this way we're doing this. And then there's really like an assessment to everyone is agreeing that this person is going to challenge us on this, that we are keeping a baseline of objectivity to how we are evaluating folks. So bias disruption accountability partner, that can be talent partners, that can be anyone that you sort of, so that's another good way too.
That's awesome. One other question is, how quickly do you think it takes a new employee to have a sense of belonging? I don't know that that's that sounds like it's kind of an individual thing, but the question is that basically sometimes baggage from a previous employer affects the sense of belonging at a new company. I would argue that's probably the case for all of your lived experiences that you carry forward. But how do you get a new employee to kind of discard some of that baggage?
Yeah, I think there's a level of what I call culture vultures, right? That exists in every culture, right? Where there is trauma sharing and there is this, telling the old story of previous leaders. So it is very difficult to overhaul culture, right? But again, I think when it comes to new employees, it really is, that's like a case by case. It really depends on I think in large part with new employees, to me, are the easiest first step for belonging than I would say existing employees, right? Because existing employees have historical data and information and experiences that you have to overcome to rebuild trust. With new employees, they're coming in at the front door, like open arms. I've obviously selected this organization as a place where I know that I'm going to be, I think it's better for me. So there's an opportunity at the gate to show people you belong. And some of that could just simply, come from really cool belonging activities. One company, when everyone comes in, they get a character sketch of them and they ask this fun assessment, what's your favorite candy bar, and what's one story that no one knows. And then they actually have a content writer who sends this character out that you get to frame on and then they tell a funny story, a curated story based on how you answer those questions. And then all of the candy that you said was your favorite candy is on your desk at the first day. So there are tons of examples like that, but I think that was one that stood out to me. And it was when I worked with them as a consultant, it was not surprising to me that their engagement for surveys was 97% engagement, that their culture was super high. They were a small organization, but that's just, I think day one, thinking about how employees come to know the culture of the company and how you greet them and welcome them in and how you get them connected into spaces they can belong, like ERGs, and tapped in, makes all the difference. I think it's much easier to get new employees to belong than it is existing employees.
And I would even piggyback off of that, because I think one other thing is that if a new employee comes into an organization and their sense and experience doesn't necessarily match the values that were sold to them, then that's going to erode everything that you pitch to that.
Exactly.
employee. So that trust is already removed out of day one, out of the gate, right? So you have to be very honest about who you are as a company and how you're framing your opportunities and your positions and your culture. Because if somebody comes in day one, they're like, this is not what they said. They're not going to trust anything that you say from there out. So being honest about your values and living your values with intention is really huge.
I have a term for that, Asheya. It's called inclusion delusion. Y'all can steal it. Inclusion delusion. It is important to, as you said, make sure that who you say you are is really who you are, because also to the point of having new employees, they're going to be the first true tellers that you were not authentically who you said you were.
Right. One other question we have is, we kind of touched on this at the beginning, but what are some effective ways to acknowledge events and scenarios that could be impacting some employees, but not others? You talked about the whole coming back on a Monday and having the, oh, how was your weekend conversation, right? I've heard directly that some firms, particularly in the AEC industry, want to say that we're not a political company, therefore they don't speak about anything. There was a lot of tension in 2020 about appropriate responses to the racial reckoning that was happening. And some firms dug in and said, we're not going to say anything, and we're going to continue to not say anything. And in terms of inclusive leadership, I would argue that's horrible to create an inclusive culture in your organization, to have, you know, a head down, head in the sand kind of view or stance, right? So what are some ways that companies who are concerned with how they don't upset their bottom line, because that's one of the concerns, right? Or how do they acknowledge that America is gonna America, and on any given day, as I say all the time, on any given day, America is America, and some people will be triggered when they come to work this afternoon or tomorrow or whatever. So how do companies kind of acknowledge that and respond?
Well, one of the things that I want to point out before I answer that question is I want to say this, that it's important to note for the leaders that are on the call. Millennials are rising to leadership. They are 16% more diverse than boomers, okay? But Gen Z by 2024 will be 48% racially ethnic, 48%, okay? So these are the new workers that are coming into Europe. And what we know about Gen Z and millennials is that their tolerance level is very low, okay? And there is now, it used to be like customers, stakeholders, but now we have the social community. And because of this kind of transition, companies can't stay silent about things that matter anymore, right? Because when we talk about deprioritizing wellness, a part of my wellness is how I experience the world, right? And so you expecting me to do my job, you expecting me to be in New York and to get on the subway and know that my life is in danger, but to come in and smile is a very unfair. And what we know about millennials and Gen Zs is that they would rather work in Bali and be an e-com than to sit in your organization and make you money when you don't care about them. So for one, this is a business imperative for you to start caring, right? That's like number one. But I also think the other thing is about understanding who you are very clearly. Two examples I always give: Ben and Jerry's, Chick-fil-A. Very opposite ends of the spectrum. They know what they stand for, what they don't stand for, and they don't budge on it. If you go to work for either one, you know what you're getting, right? And so it doesn't make any company wrong or right or indifferent. What it makes them is clear, right? And clarity is the key when we talk about belonging and connection. And so I think it is important to not like tuck our heads in the sand and say, I'm not going to be a part of this conversation, but instead to get clear about who you are as an organization. What are the core pillars? What are the imperatives to like humanity that you deeply care about, and to be honest about those things, so that when you don't say anything, people know why. When you do something, say something, people know why. Because I think that is more of, it's the confusion of it all, really. I think that, and quite frankly, I just think people can tuck their heads in the sand, but the landscape of the world is changing. Gen Z has options, and those options don't have to be traditionally building your firms and organizations and corporations anymore.
So true, so true. One other question, and then we will transition to a couple of poll questions for our segue into the panel conversation. One attendee is asking, where do you find the line between quote unquote, stay at the not so great company and try to make incremental changes from within versus leave, give them feedback, hope it improves, and work on yourself and your happiness?
Yeah, here's the thing. I started with the 5 attributes about me, right? I've come to know those things about myself over a 20-year career. And that is because I've had to pivot. And I know those things, and based on knowing those things now, I have the freedom of no's, whether it's projects or consulting, or whether it is inside workplaces. I have the freedom of no now because I don't feel the pressure. Now, in fairness, there has been a lot of tenure and experience that has built me the freedom to be able to say no. But I think in part, I wish someone had told me earlier in my career that I had more power than I thought I had. And I think what happens is we see this with all kinds of companies. I mean, how many times have we seen this in the fashion industry? We've seen it in companies who originally said, we're going to build an entire brand. Actually, Netflix has a series right now. I won't call the company out. We're going to build a whole brand on exclusionary behavior. Okay. And then you see someone like Rihanna, who comes into a $40 trillion industry and says, we're not size inclusive, we're not foundational, like foundation and makeup, we're not inclusive. And within 4 years surpasses, and now she has competitors who have been in the industry for 40 years, like Victoria's Secret and MAC, closing stores because what she did was serve a gap, right? And like I realized, and so to me, I think when it comes to like your own personal choice, it is your own empowered choice. But what I'll say is that there's always a place for you somewhere. And I've learned that personally in my own career. So hopefully that's helpful.
100%. Okay, so we have a few poll questions. I will try to work in the other questions that have popped up. I know there are some that are being thrown out in the chat, but if you have an actual question, please put that in the Q&A so that we can best address that. But we do have a few poll questions as we transition into our panel conversation that will just kind of help some of the discussion. So could we get the first poll question up, please? So would you describe the culture of your organization as inclusive? So go ahead and vote on that. And we'll let that get to a good measurable mark. All right, so I'll go ahead and end that poll now. We are at about 62% who believe that their organization is inclusive and about 38% who say not inclusive. So that lens is also very interesting. Next question, please. Of the traits of inclusive leadership, which would you say is the most important? And we have a range: commitment, courage, curiosity, cognizance of bias, cultural intelligence, and collaboration. So those traits of inclusive leadership, which do you individually think is most important? Pretty fair split across the board. I think this is one of those questions where it is a personal perspective, but 27% believe it's cognizance of bias is the most important, followed by a tie between commitment and collaboration, which I think is interesting. Oh, I'm sorry, courage is actually a point above that. So very interesting, close proximity there. Can we get the next poll question, please? All right, so this is a great segue into our panel conversation. Which of these competencies do you most appreciate in a leader? Strategic and visionary, authentic and transparent, inspirational, knowledgeable, or trustworthy? They're all valuable attributes and traits. Transparency and authenticity is tracking by a landslide there. So I think I would agree with that as well. I think some of these things, you can always gain a little bit more knowledge. Authenticity and transparency and trust, I think, are things that need to be baked into character. And so I think that's just really important as we think about how we're leading organizations. So Toni, thank you so much for that really robust presentation. I appreciate all the statistical insights about the changing work environment and the foundational principles of DEI for our group and belonging. As the DEI committee has been working over the past year and a half, we have been making significant strides for SMPS, but we still have a lot of work to do, as do our member firms, which I think you can see through the Q&A. From this conversation, we know that diversity initiatives can bring a broad range of people into an organization, but inclusive leadership is what makes them feel welcome and stay there. And that's reflective for both SMPS as a professional association that people are paying to be a part of, as well as their jobs that they pay in time and energy to go participate and contribute to on a daily basis. And I really appreciated, Toni, the belonging as the emotional subset of connection and how that shows up in groups and teams. So today we're going to transition into this panel conversation and connect that tactical information to the AEC industry. And we know it's a really interesting conversation because there are barriers to inclusion in our industry that are even separate of just who you are as an individual. Our work by nature has barriers to inclusion, from project managers who are in the office environment versus craft workers who are out in the field actually doing the labor and work. We have a difference in levels between subcontractors and subconsultants versus primes. So there is some other layers and levels to the complexity of the AEC industry in terms of inclusion and inclusive leadership. So if I could get our other panelists to turn on their cameras and join into the conversation. And while they do that, I will introduce everyone individually. We already know about how awesome Toni is. She is going to stay in and stay on our panel with us today. We have Paula Stamp, who is Dr. Paula Stamp, who is joining us from PCL Construction Services. She's the Director of Business Development for PCL out in California, and also a national board member for the Society for Marketing Professional Services. In her role at PCL, she's responsible for maintaining current client relationships, qualifying and securing new business opportunities, completing market research, strategic planning, departmental oversight of the BD and Marketing Communications Group, as well as diversity and inclusion. So thank you, Dr. Paula Stamp, for joining us today. Next, we have Halima McWilliams. She is an associate principal at Corgan, which is a global architecture and design firm, and she brings 25 years of experience in DEI work as well as strategic HR to aid organizations in crafting customized, practical, and realistic solutions that work. And so her lens of the AEC industry from an HR perspective is going to be helpful in our conversation. And then we have Mike Geary, who is our President and Chief Executive Officer for SMPS and for the SMPS Foundation, joining in to give that lens into how the society is moving forward and integrating DEI practices and inclusive leadership from his perspective as well. So thanks everyone for joining in. Are we all unmuted and ready to have this conversation? Any immediate feedback from Toni's presentation that anyone wants to jump in with right out of the gate?
Yeah, I'll jump right in and say, wow, thank you. I wrote down some things I'm never going to forget. Inclusion delusion, which I love, and the practice hygiene of failure, I think is really critical as well. And I jumped right in because I'm excited about what you had to say, Toni. So I think that my takeaway is like, there's so much work to be done. Still, of course, right? I mean, as an organization, we really started to address this in 2020. It's only been a couple of years, and that's nothing in the great scheme of things. And honestly, in the transparent thing, we addressed the issue of summer of 2020 through an email blast and essentially a press release out to our membership and to our allies. And we were really nervous about it because as an organization, we had never addressed societal issues. And it was like, okay, push the button, here we go. And, I'm excited that we got great response, very little pushback. I'm sure we even did get any. And the point was that you got to start somewhere. And we started that with our members. And it's great to see this evolve within the organization. So that's a media thing as a response to Toni.
Yeah, I'd also like to jump in and say thank you, Toni. What an amazing wealth of knowledge in presenting that to us. One of the things that stood out to me was talking about belonging. And, as a researcher, I've actually researched sense of belonging with college students and particularly with students of color. And when I was looking at the statistics that you had up, I'm like, wow, I mean, you look at what a sense of belonging does for someone when they have it and what it takes away from someone when they don't. And just kind of the correlation I could see from college students to being employees, and how some of the statistics that you brought up are common with college students on college campuses when they don't feel like they belong. So it can start early, and it kind of manifests itself throughout people's lifetimes when they don't have that.
Yeah.
That you brought it
I think too, the point, Michael, that you all made of taking a start and pressing the send button, as Corrigan being part of the large firm roundtable amongst other global architecture and design firms, we're in connection with about 59 other firms. And for Corrigan, we're an 84-year-old firm now, but there was hesitation as well on our part because we had never done that prior to my joining. But to Toni's point earlier, there is an expectation, and there will continue to be an expectation with generations coming, who are younger, who are looking for the talk and the walk to be aligned. But I do like what you said in that a start is taking action. And a lot of times people are so like, oh my God, we don't know, we need to do this, we're not sure. Just start and recognize that each organization that's represented on this call, you all's journey is going to be as unique as a fingerprint. It's not going to look like the next companies, and how those best practices are important and are helpful in avoiding certain failures. They're going to be failures that are going to be unique to you all's culture, to you all's leadership, that you need to experience so that you can create an environment that's authentic for those who help it to be productive and collective and collaborative.
I agree. Go ahead, Toni.
No, I was going to say, I think that's so true. It's interesting because I see someone wrote in the chat that they left a company because of their lack of response. And we're seeing that more and more, as you know, the Great Resignation or reassignment or reevaluation. I mean, it has like 9 names at this point. But the war on talent is increasing. People have increasingly more options. Companies are becoming increasingly more flexible. And people are going to choose companies that are prioritizing their wellness, their mental health, and of course, inclusion and belonging. And so I think that's like, just something to call out that and I think someone earlier in the chat I was reading through the chat said, if you don't decide who you are as a company, then the world will decide it for you, right? And I think that was such a good call out. I can't remember who said it, but I know someone said it when I was reading through the comments. So.
Awesome. Well, Paula and Halima, I'd like to get your insights on just demonstrating inclusive leadership across the spectrum of AEC employees. So individual contributors versus departmental and studio leaders versus project managers and craft workers. How can, the leader of the organization demonstrate inclusivity, but then also mid-level leaders also exude that as well? What does that look like?
For me, and what I've seen here thus far, is stop pulling from the same well every time and really listening to, many organizations are coming off of their performance review cycles, or they do them biannually, whatever that looks like. Actually listening to what your employee wants, and not to say that every want is going to be answered, but start to take inventory, and be it if it's on a spreadsheet, be it if you have a system, whatever that looks like, and begin to capture the desires, the aspirations, but also capture some of the real deal technical skills that this person may have a specialty in, have a heavy, interest in and begin to position and point them into those projects and opportunities that allow them exposure. They don't need to, none of us came to the table as subject matter experts out the womb. It's just not a thing. But we have to give people the opportunity to experience it, because they may get in there and say, you know what, I thought I wanted to do aviation. This sucks. I want those quick and easy projects. Our aviation projects are sometimes 8 to 10 years long, whereas commercial or our interiors projects or some of our other sectors, they are more short-run projects. So sometimes it's allowing people to test and try some things. But as a leader, your responsibility is to say, you want to taste? You got it. Now, once you're there, you got to make some decisions. But as leaders, it's our job to facilitate the opportunity.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think it's also from a leadership standpoint, we have to stop going back to the people that we know and take advice from people maybe that we have not had a lot of interaction with. I remember having a female boss who quite often would say, when you're giving me names of people for projects or for promotions, whatever, I want to see people on this list that don't look like each other, right? I want to see what you're doing with everyone and make sure that you're taking the opportunity to engage with people that you don't always engage with. I had a really great boss a while back, and he and I were the complete opposite. He was from Canada, I'm from here. He's a white male, I'm not. And even though we were exact opposites and probably wouldn't have necessarily hung out if we didn't know each other at work, he took the time to get to know me along with all the other leadership that we had in the district at the time. And he and I actually became really good friends. And so one of the things that one of our VPs would do is he would take some of the department heads to his cabin. And I was a department head. I was never invited. And that's a part of that exclusion that happens for women a lot. But this particular boss also had a cabin, and he invited the department heads, and he invited me too. And I didn't go because I don't like the woods. That's not my thing. But that was okay because I was still included, right? So we would find other things to do that would give him an opportunity to get to know me. And so I think from a leadership standpoint, we can't just gravitate towards people who look like us or who have the same lived experiences as us. We need to talk to everyone and get to know them, however that might be. Be open to that.
Paula,
and I think one other thing too, Asheya, is that we also have to be open, and Toni hit on it a little bit earlier, is inviting people to the table who are going to bring a perspective that you simply don't have, and being vulnerable enough and honest enough to say, I need you here because I believe your lived experience, your femaleness, your Blackness, your whatever it may be, is a missing part of this conversation, and I don't feel equipped, I don't feel comfortable, and owning their position, but also saying, and I want to share this space with you because I believe you may bring value to this. I'm participating on a project team now for a renovation of a high school, and a fellow peer of mine tapped me on the shoulder to say, hey, Halima, would you participate in these community meetings, because it's in a urban part of Dallas, and I'm not a Dallasite, but do I have the lived experience of being a Black person in America? I absolutely do. Do I have a mother who's been an educator in an urban community in St. Louis for 40 years? Absolutely, that is my pedigree. And I have other understandings of the African-American culture in America. So clearly I'm gonna bring a perspective. However, what I did say is, but I'm not the Black people whisperer. So let's be clear. Let's be clear that my experience doesn't represent the monolith of the 13% that occupy this space. Each of us on this phone, white male, cis, woman, whatever, wherever you fall in the spectrum or in the intersection, your story is unique enough to bring a perspective that I won't have. But we have to be able to normalize the conversations to say, hey, I know you think, I may be a mom, but I'm a mom of one. You're a mom of multiple. So our stories, as much as we share the motherhood story, they're still different. So being okay having those conversations and being okay making mistakes in the midst of those conversations.
And we also have to lean into those voices to make sure that they contribute to the conversation, right? It's having a lens and a perspective to say somebody's voice is missing. Whose voice do I need to have here? But the other key is making sure it's not isolated. You need that input regardless of what community that project is in, right? Because there are people and end users and stakeholders for the work that we're doing who reflect that, even if it's not the large majority. So I appreciate the fact that you were tapped to be on this project team, but I also want you to be tapped for the next project team that might be in a more affluent or historically white community as well, because your voice is also impactful and meaningful there as well, right? And so I think
absolutely.
And
absolutely. Go ahead.
Can I also say, I was going to add to this point, because I like to point out how this shows up in the opposite way so that it's a good correlation. As a strategist, what I often see is people come in and they go, help me fix the marginalized people. If one more person asks me, can we build a mentorship program? You have talent that are across varying intersections, that are talented, that are equally smart, have the same pedigrees. But what we want to do, and this is sort of how the system maintains itself, is we want to bring you in and then make you assimilate into a culture that fits into our own utopia. So we want to then bring you in and say, well, you don't have these exposures, so therefore you're not. So why don't we we're going to put you in a special mentor program. And so we continue to marginalize you even more. The reality is that what varying communities need is the same exposure, the same amount of equity, the same amount of belonging, the same amount of connection. And how this shows up oftentimes is this ability, and I say this in my LinkedIn course, is that I am not the work. I am not the work. The culture is the work. The company is the work, right? And so I'm so appreciative to Halima for making that example, because I think that's how it shows up. So if you find yourself wanting to fix marginalized groups by creating programmatic work, when your talent is already sharp and equipped, that is how it shows up. And as a strategist, what I often tell people is like, that is not the answer. How do we disrupt bias in your system? Why is that happening? Let's follow the data, right? So I wanted to just share that, because I'd like to point out like how that shows up in your work environment so that people can make the connection.
And there was a recent article that I just read, and that talked about typically people of color and women are the most over-mentored group in the corporate workspace. So as everybody that's on this line who has influence, who has decision-making ability, who's at the table when it comes to succession planning and whatnot, and to that point of creating yet another programmatic intervention, that's not the right intervention. The intervention is the opportunity to then allow these already sharp people to come in and actually exercise their ability. And to your point, not to continue to feed the system that was never designed for them.
Yeah, we call that over-mentored and under-sponsored. And that happens a lot.
Yeah, it's about access. It's about access. And, when we don't have that, then we don't actually have the opportunity to use those skill sets optimally, right? When we're not, a part of the group that actually has the ear of the CEO or has the ear of the client even, right, in our business. So yeah, absolutely.
One term that's swirling in the midst of this dialogue is tokenism, and being careful and mindful to avoid it. Toni or Halima, can you go into a little bit of an explanation of tokenism and being careful about not doing that? Because I do see a lot of particularly clients who are doing project pursuits or chasing work. And if it's a public project, of course, they want to make sure they have a diverse team. but it's
Mhm.
because they want the points for the diversity, not because they innately want a diverse team for diversity of thought and perspective, right? It's
Yeah.
to make sure that the scoring committee sees a Black woman and another woman, and okay, we've got those boxes checked. So that becomes a
Mhm.
little bit of performative tokenism as well. They may stay on the project if it's awarded, they may be reassigned, but can y'all talk a little bit about defining tokenism so that the audience understands what that looks like?
So it's so interesting because I just had a conversation with someone who was asking, like, was I selected because I was as a token, right? And here's the simple answer to this is like, in my mind, there is a very thin line, particularly when we know as you rise to certain leader levels, the levels of representation that comes in all intersections, not just in ethnicity, but in gender and neurodiversity and sexual orientation, everything. And what I will say is that tokenism to me is when you are selected as a face. We have an old school saying, you're the butter knife. You just there to butter the bread. That's it, right? And so tokenism is when you are there. You have somebody's gonna go crazy in the chat about that. But it's when you are there as a face and a representative, but you are silenced, right? You have no voice. And I think sometimes because of the lack of representation, the experience of being the only and being other can feel like tokenism. And so we got to figure out a way, like, and I often have this conversation, if you, very similar to Halima, like saying, yeah, I know why you want me. I know why you want my voice. I know why you want my expertise. I have that experience, and leaning into that because you are not being silenced, you're being selected for you to raise your voice. And so there is this like very thin line on like whether or not you're going to just make your own self a token as well. So I think we have seen in circumstances, particularly with now RFPs where clients are asking like you must have a certain percentage of diversity, and people just being kind of slapped on and left out of emails. I think we know very clearly that if you are silenced, you don't have a voice, and you are literally just, as I call the butter knife in the setting, that you are a token. And I think there's a difference between being an only and there being an issue of representation and being a token.
And it's a difficult position to be in, to be the only. I am, along with my peer that actually asked me to join her project team, we are the first two women of color to ascend to the rank of associate principal in this 84 years of the firm. So there's a great responsibility that we both have, and I can't speak for her as much as I can speak for myself. There is that component and that mental, kind of tackling. Why am I here? Am I supposed to be here? I literally had this conversation with my leader during my performance review. He was like, I knew you thought that way, but we wanted you here. The CEO, the president, they said, hey, you need to make this happen. It was no question. And I needed to hear that as a human, that affirmation, and I knew I was supposed to be here. However, there is still, because of the conditioning that this system has all infected us with, we always are in this state of, but okay, am I here because I'm the Black girl at the table? And yes, she speaks well, but I can do other things too. I can juggle, I can, braid hair, I can do stuff.
Halima,
I'm an international best-selling author. Like, I kind of got some stuff going on. It's just two things.
As a leader, I do think about those things and, caution myself and invite, not just where I'm employed today, but in my career. I'm wondering how do you overcome that? What's the way to communicate? I think we're all looking for some practical things too. Like, how do I communicate an invitation so I'm clear that it's not about because you are an X, whatever it is. It's because of all the things, because you can also juggle and you also, whatever it might be. I'm not, homogenous person either. I have lots of things about me that people don't know or do know. But right. So how do we communicate that? How do we, as a leader of any way, like a team or whatever it might be, or as a peer?
I think, Michael, and then Toni, I'll pop it over to you. I think part of it is there's two parts of this relationship. It's me needing to step into, and I think we talked about it earlier, I've had some bad past experiences working in the DEI space in organizations to where many people don't know, DEI practitioners experience a level of trauma that is beyond talking about at times. It's too much. However, I also know that this is my purpose work. So at an organization where I am fully embraced for my talents, my time, my understand, all of those things, I have to decide these people actually celebrate and want to do this work. And Halima, this is your time, your assignment to usher them along. And so I think that, but the underscoring of all of that is relationship building. I've got to get to know my CEO. I've got to get to know my presidents. I've got to get to know people from the housekeeper on up and from top to bottom to know that I belong here too and the work that I'm doing matters.
I was just going to simply say that I'm going to say something that might sound radical or not radical. You know, we often treat DEI and the idea of connection, belonging, and having transparent conversations with, underserved groups and folks like it is like something that is impossible. But the truth of the matter is, if you were solving a problem for the client and DEI was like the brief, right, that you received, this is the problem that I have. You know what we would do? We would get data, we would get the best of the talent that we could, and we would solve that problem. DEI is no different than any other business issue that you have. The difference is our level of discomfort with it and prioritizing it, right? So even when it comes to everyday conversations, I would challenge, then ask yourself the question, why don't I have this same challenge with someone who looks like me having this conversation? And so then that becomes back to my first point, which is we are not the work, right? So if there is a pause, I find it difficult to give Halima, I need to work out why that is, right? What is the difficulty in me being able to have the same conversation with Halima that I would very casually have with someone else? And I think those are the things that we have to get through. And I always say to people, how are you participating? Right? This is not about, am I a bad person? Are you a bad person? Are you racist? Am I racist? This is how are we all participating and maintaining a system that we did not build or create? And so in that, I think the real answer to having tangible answers is the appetite to do better, the appetite to recognize and have self-awareness, right? That's the answer. I think is in my opinion, right? We gotta get more clear on bias disruption and challenging ourselves.
And Toni,
and being honest, I'm sorry.
No, I was
just being honest about where you all are as a culture and evaluating your maturity. So going back to that statement earlier, Michael, we were hesitant to press in. Corrigan was a bit as well because we didn't want to get it wrong. Nobody wants the viral, lashings now and all of those things. But we have to decide to take a start and make those mistakes along the way and be okay with the good things that we do, but know that we still have other work that has to be done, and we will get there. And I tell people, this is an over time journey. When we first started our journey back in 2020, right after George Floyd, and it just timing-wise is when we launched our DEI strategy, I told people that we're talking about a story of over 400 years of systematic injustices and imbalances. One conversation is not about to overturn 400 years of infection. It just doesn't work. So if people are, but a lot of times people, I want to do something. Start with listening. Listen, that's an action word. And it's probably the highest level that you can demonstrate to others by sitting in the discomfort of, I'm not saying you contributed to it. I'm not saying that you burned a cross. I'm not saying that you beat somebody about the head, neck, and shoulders. What I am saying is that in this America, this melting pot that we say that there's equal access and all the things, that is not a true story for all.
I think that it's, there's a joke going on about Gen Xers, and I'm a Gen X, so shout out. And my professional training in the early days around people management was keep your mouth shut.
Right.
Not my problem. Sorry, you have an issue at home. Sorry, you're dealing with whatever it is in society. Sorry, I couldn't even say sorry. You were literally trained not to do that, not to engage It's only was about behavior in the office, period. But what we're learning and evolving, and it's taking years, is that our office is not an island, right? We're not just cogs in this machine. And it may feel like a machine sometimes, but we're not. And so we all have to come together, and we bring all of that into the office. We bring it into our houses. We go home and complain about work too, right? So we bring it both ways in our environments, and we spend more time with our people in the office than we might do, I mean, literally and figuratively, than our own spouses or family. We had I wouldn't call it a truth and reconciliation moment in SMPS, but we did provide an opportunity, and Paula may remember, and our staff, that we created an opportunity in a variety of times. We're trying to get better at this culture of like, just tell your truth. And we everyone had an opportunity to tell their truth and say, this is my life. This is what I'm bringing into the room. So, I may behave a certain way because I also have 55 years of injustice against me in different ways. And, I want people to know about that, right? So I think that was very helpful in sort of this journey of this start somewhere and then be open to your truth and let people tell their stories and tell your own as well.
And I think Michael, what's so important about this, and I feel like I say it every time we have a town hall meeting or have a conversation about this for SMPS and the work that we're trying to do as a committee, is that it's not just organizational change work, right? Organizations, associations are made up of people. People have to do their own work in this journey.
That's right.
And the point to that, and why it's so important to do that self-work, is there will be a point in time where you digest all of this history of this America that we live in, right? And you will become so overwhelmed that you have to change your behavior and have to wave the flag within your organization, because by doing the work, it will become such a passion point for you that it can't help but spill over, right? And so that work life versus home life, if you do the work, it will become one and the same. So we have had a very riveting conversation. We have not done any of the questions that we needed to, but it's okay. We have touched on a lot of the things kind of without being directly in line with the conversation flow. But I do want to open the floor up to Q&A and the chat. If there are any other questions, we have about 8 minutes left. And if there are not any direct questions, I will field one or two that I do think is important for us to connect to today's conversation. Someone
said they put one in it, Q&A.
Okay, let's see.
Looks like there's 6.
Oh, yes. All right. So there are some here. Let me filter through these really quickly. Okay, so here's one that resonates with our audience. How can marketing influence technical leaders to hire a more diverse workforce? And I have a tension with that because there's some cultural things that we can talk about as well that Toni touched on in terms of belonging. But Halima and Paula, what are your thoughts on, again, we're trying to fill org chart positions with diversity. How do we actually make that be part of the corporate culture?
I think part of what I've had the privilege and good work of doing is working with our chief marketing officer and her team. And we've talked about and I've educated them on, and they also have an irritation around, I'll say, even just the photos we use. Many times when we're having to submit different things, some years ago, it was stock photos, or it was very old photos from 5 years ago, because that's the best that we had. And now we have become more intentional in regards to not just capturing current state workforce and whatnot, but now their eyeballs are trained to say, this picture is really white. Yeah, it is. Or this picture is very men heavy. Yeah, it is. And sometimes that's still just a fact. At our senior executive leadership level, it still may be the thing, but their conscience has been awakened. And so it's easier for me to then have a conversation to say, hey, y'all, the next time we do X, Y, and Z, we need to be sure that we're capturing, the community in a different way that demonstrates our work outside of here, even that may impact a urban neighborhood or may impact some other areas where marginalized communities have now experienced our goodness, but we need to capture that in our storytelling so that internally and externally we can tell a better story and not a false story or a story from 5 years ago, because that's the only picture we have. Like, throwback pictures don't work anymore. People can look all this stuff up now.
Right.
Yeah, and I would add to
Also, who's really there, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and I would add to that is, I think a way to influence is to educate. So when I worked with our HR department, this was several years ago, we looked at recruiting. So where are we recruiting for interns? Where are we recruiting for recent college grads? And if we're going to campuses that are homogenous, then that's probably what we're going to get.
Yep.
So, but I can't just say to them, you need to have a wider swath. I have to help them get there. So I did the research on HBCUs, on HSIs, so Hispanic serving institutions and historically Black colleges and universities, and gave that list to them and said, here's the schools that have the programs that we would be pulling from other schools anyways. So we should be recruiting at these schools. Let's go out and recruit from them. And so I think there's a lot that marketing can do to educate in that sense with their technical staff and even with their HR to help them have the resources to look and widen, and broaden their horizons as to, how we're recruiting, how we're messaging, what we're putting out there in the world.
And then also, if we do go to PWIs, which we're always going to go to, that's okay. But if you go to the University of Kansas, they have the sororities, the fraternities, the Black Student Government Associations. Ensure that you as a marketer or as a business leader or a decision maker, that you really maximize your visit. Stop going to the same darn auditorium, talking to the same darn career advisor. Like,
Exactly.
do your work. Stop
Right.
being lazy. And I mean, and that's really a lot of what we have to challenge ourselves is to actually do the work. And the work is really work. Like, you got to do it.
That's one of the things that we noticed early on with the task force is that where the recruiting opportunities lie and broadening that, particularly for professional services marketing in terms of business development, marketing, communications, we can have a wider pool. And if us as marketing and business development professionals look at that as an opportunity to help our firms and thereby the industry overall diversify, that's an opportunity for us to lean into. And so you don't necessarily have to follow the same track for recruiting for those roles and those positions. You have a wider net. You can go to community colleges, you can go to high school programs directly, like you have a whole different pool of resources to choose from. I'm going to pull one last question and then we're going to have a hard log off, y'all. So one important question that I wanted us to talk through in terms of inclusive leadership is thinking about exploring equity versus equality and how that shows up in the AEC environment when it comes to HR and technical and project work, right? So we've talked a little bit about, how we're recruiting and hiring, but what does that do in terms of equity and equality and the work that we produce in terms of the built environment? Paula, Halima.
I'll simply say this, and this goes to equity. Get your pay right. And this is at the leadership level who make those decisions. If you know that the money is off, there's money out there to fix it, period. And these younger generations, I was just on the phone with my 23-year-old sister who is telling me she's about to ask for a 20% increase. Bless her heart. However, these young folks are asking for the money, and there's available information out there to understand and justify their ask. And they're also asking, show me your books now.
Right.
And now in this month in May in New York, pay transparency is a thing. May 15th, you got to put it on the job rec. So the accessibility to information is more and more prevalent. And this talent that we're at war for is expecting us to be authentic, not just in we're hiring women, we're hiring Black folks. They also want to know that their bag is right.
Right.
Right. And in California,
I think
it's here.
Oh,
Yeah, in California, it's already here. So
Yeah.
you cannot pay men and women differently for the same jobs. So if you think that's happening, raise your voice, right? Because
Yeah.
that is absolutely real. And I think what happens is companies, they ask you, what are you making when you go to a new firm, because they want to see if they can get away with something different than what really is owed for that position. So educate yourself on what the position is and what it really does make.
Yeah, I was just gonna, oh, go ahead.
I just have a quick observation, and that is, I find it really interesting. We're marketing professionals talking about HR functions, and it's all blending together. And what is our role in that? What is our role in that? And that is, it's a huge role. And I want to encourage our listeners to think about that as an expansion of their talent and their knowledge base, is managing, leading people in that traditional sense, but all these other things that now marketing is really directing in so many firms.
Yeah, and I just
Toni.
wanted to, like, as the resident strategist, to say first at a baseline, the difference between equality and equity. Equality is, you know, everyone gets the same thing, right? You get a pot of gold, you get a car, you get a car, like, oh, you get a car, you get a car, everybody gets a car. Equity is, you know, you get equity based on your specific circumstance, right? So you are compensated along the lines of your particular skill set, you know, those things. So I just wanted to say that in case someone was confused about the difference between equity and equality. I think lastly, I would just add that, you know, as someone who grew up in the talent space and HR space, we tend to beat up HR a lot. But the reality is, if you learn nothing today, that diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging are the responsibility of everyone, right? Everybody has a part to play. Sometimes it is not a front door issue. Sometimes it's a back door. I know some recruiting teams that are kicking butt. They are doing everything and people are falling out the bottom. Like, it is a bottomless pit, right? Because the conditions internally. So I used to say to my CEO, you can ask me to go out and get 21 flavors of ice cream, but if we don't have freezers inside, everybody's gonna melt, right? And so the reality is we have to have the conditions to be successful. So this is a revamping of how we challenge bias disruption in our talent systems, and as marketers, how we help them better market those things. But we all have a responsibility, going back to my initial, what is to not normalize bias and to challenge the system. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you all so much. We are a couple of minutes over, but I do want to bring up the fact that the task force is working on some resources for SMPS and members in the industry overall. One of them is an inclusive language guide. So as Halima brought up the point of what do proposals and deliverables look like? How are things worded? How are things addressed? We know that that's going to be a target for our group. And so based off of today's conversation, I think we will probably come up with some follow-up resources. I know there were some questions and items in the chat that we didn't have enough time to address today. So stay tuned to the SMPS DEI page for additional content. And thank you again for your time. And thank you to our panelists for joining today. The recording will be on the DEI page. Thanks so much. Y'all have a great
attend Amplify if you want more discussion. Please be with us this July in Atlanta.
Yes, thank you.